Europe is going through one of the most dangerous moments in recent years. China has imposed sanctions against two European banks. At first glance, a trifle. In reality, a warning. Beijing is showing that it can strike much larger institutions as well. And it all started with Europe itself. It was the EU that first imposed sanctions on Chinese banks for cooperating with Russia. Meanwhile, Washington is increasing the pressure. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is pushing the EU to punish BRICS countries. But he does this not for Europe's sake, rather to protect the dollar. For the EU, this is extremely costly, since trade with BRICS runs into hundreds of billions of euros. Italy's example shows just how deep this dependence is. Take Pirelli, a company in which a large stake belongs to a Chinese state firm, supposedly opening access to China's auto market. Yet Trump's team blocked Pirelli tires from being sold for Formula One in the US, citing national security. And now Trump is preparing a massive blow against the chip industry. Such a move could drive up prices, destroy supply chains, and drag Europe into chaos alongside the US. That's why in this video we'll break down all these developments, so stay tuned. And let's start with Trump's warning, a threat aimed directly at BRICS, which became the basis for Europe's latest mistake. Just a few weeks ago, Donald Trump appeared before cameras with a statement that shook governments around the world. He warned BRICS countries that if they tried to create an alternative to the dollar, they would face tariffs. Not selective ones, but at least 10% on everything, without exception. The message was perfectly clear. The dollar must remain at the center of global trade. Otherwise, America will make others pay for disobedience. And this is where Europe stepped forward. Instead of considering its own interests, Brussels rushed to show full support for Washington. In early August, the EU unveiled a new sanctions package, the 18th since the start of the war in Ukraine. And hidden inside was an unexpected clause: sanctions against two small Chinese banks. These were Suifenhe Rural Commercial Bank and Haihe Rural Commercial Bank. Their business is mostly local, cross-border trade, regional financing, and even some crypto operations. The EU claimed these banks help Russia evade sanctions and announced that starting August 9th, European companies were forbidden from working with them. But here lies the paradox. These banks do not operate in Europe anyway. They have no clients there, no transactions, no presence in the European financial system, meaning Brussels gained virtually nothing. But Beijing was provoked. And this happened despite explicit warnings. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi repeatedly told EU diplomats, "If you impose sanctions on our banks, there will be consequences." The warning was ignored, and the result was predictable. China immediately prepared a response. On August 13th, Beijing announced sanctions against two Lithuanian banks, UAB Urbobankas and AB Mano Bankas. These are not giants either, but small players in Lithuania's domestic market. Yet the point is not size, but symbolism. China has had a conflict with Lithuania since 2021, when Vilnius allowed Taiwan to open a Taiwanese representative office. Beijing's reaction was harsh, downgrading diplomatic relations, expelling diplomats, and blocking Lithuanian exports. So when the EU struck at Chinese banks, Beijing knew exactly where to respond. The sanctions banned Chinese companies and citizens from working with these two Lithuanian banks. The choice was deliberate. China was making a point. The size of the institutions does not matter. The message itself does. Escalation will not be left unanswered. And this has become a signal for all of Europe, because if we look at the balance of power, it is Europe that is vulnerable, not China. The reality is simple. In this confrontation, Europe has far more at stake than China. In 2024, trade between the EU and China reached almost 800 billion euros. China is a key market for European automobiles, luxury goods, and industrial equipment. German auto giants Volkswagen and BMW sell more cars in China than they do at home. French companies like LVMH depend on Chinese buyers of champagne, fashion, and luxury. Italy supplies machinery and equipment, while Spain exports agricultural products. And the dependence works both ways. Europe imports from China critically important goods, solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, rare earth metals, and pharmaceuticals. Without these, the EU's green transition, the shift to renewable energy and electric mobility, would simply grind to a halt. So why risk all this over sanctions against two rural banks that do not even operate in Europe? The answer is simple: because of Washington. Brussels is following Trump, even though his policy directly harms Europe itself. Just a few weeks ago, he threatened tariffs on European cars and steel, accusing the EU of exploiting America in trade. Yet despite this, Brussels once again aligns itself with Washington. As a result, Europe has ended up with no real choice: pressure China to please Trump, even as Trump is preparing strikes against Europe itself. And his tariff threats are not only aimed at China or Russia, they cover the entire BRICS bloc, which now includes more than 20 countries, among them Brazil, India, and South Africa. Precisely the markets Europe vitally needs as alternative partners. And Russia, the very reason all this began, has not collapsed. Moscow has created parallel payment systems, sells oil and gas to India and China in local currencies, and is already testing the digital yuan. Sanctions against two small border banks have had no effect on this. In the end, it is pure symbolism. Brussels wanted to show unity with Washington and appear tough on Moscow, but in reality, it only provoked China, a partner Europe cannot afford to lose, and got nothing in return. To truly understand what is happening, one must look at the bigger picture. Washington is fighting to preserve control over the global financial system. The dollar remains the world's main reserve currency, but BRICS countries are increasingly building alternatives. That is what enraged Trump. His tariff threats are not just about trade, they are about defending the dollar's role at the core of everything. The problem is that each threat only brings BRICS closer together. The bloc is expanding, admitting new members, and investing in payment systems that bypass the dollar. At the latest BRICS summit, cross-border settlement was a central issue, and trade in national currencies is only gaining momentum. Instead of slowing the process, Trump's pressure campaign is accelerating it, and now Europe has found itself at the epicenter of this storm. Instead of building balance and protecting its own interests, Brussels has tied itself to Washington's agenda. And this leaves the EU vulnerable not only to China's response, but also to the global shift in trade and finance away from the dollar. Europe could have become a bridge between the sides, but instead it is binding itself tightly to a partner whose leverage is weakening, while the rest of the world is learning to live without the dollar. Italy is a vivid example of how US pressure shapes Europe's choices. At first glance, Rome is cutting trade with China, but the decision is driven not by economics, but by fear of Washington's reaction. Chinese investments were a lifeline for certain sectors in Italy. They created jobs, brought in technology, and opened access to a vast consumer market. But instead of developing this cooperation, Italy is being pushed to roll it back. Take Pirelli, the flagship of Italian industry. The Chinese state corporation Sinochem owns 37% of the company. One would expect that this would open doors to the Chinese auto market and new growth opportunities. But things turned out differently. The US intervened and blocked Pirelli tires from being sold for Formula One in America, once again under the pretext of national security. Even tires were declared a threat. It sounds absurd, but it clearly illustrates the reality. Washington decides which European companies can grow and which must be constrained. Europe is suffering from its own decisions. German exports to China have plummeted since 2022, especially in automobiles and precision machinery. The rejection of Russian energy has forced industry to operate on far more expensive resources. At present, manufacturers in the EU pay 2 to 3 times more for energy than their competitors in Asia. This gap is eroding competitiveness, forcing factories to cut production, move capacity abroad, and lay off workers. And at this very moment, Washington is preparing a step that could shake not only the EU, but the entire global economy: an escalation of the tariff war in semiconductors. The most alarming turn in this story comes from Washington. According to leaks from the administration, Trump is preparing tariffs of up to 300% on foreign microchips. The goal is obvious: to force giants like TSMC, Samsung, and Japanese suppliers, such as Tokyo Electron, to relocate key supply chains to the United States. But the consequences will be enormous. If companies comply, production costs in America will skyrocket. Labor and infrastructure there are far more expensive than in East Asia, and rising costs will hit every sector. If they refuse, it will be American consumers who pay the price. Chip prices will rise, and with them, the cost of everything from smartphones and laptops to electric vehicles and defense systems. At the same time, supplies of rare earth elements, already under strain, will come under even greater pressure. Washington is not moving toward thoughtful industrial planning, but toward an attempt to seize control of the global semiconductor market through brute force. But the gamble is extremely risky. Can America really coerce Asian producers into compliance without provoking countermeasures that could cripple its own tech sector? And the consequences will not be limited to US borders. If Trump takes this step, the trade structure that sustains both the US and the EU could collapse. For Europe, already squeezed between China's retaliatory measures and Washington's demands, it would mean being dragged into a storm it cannot control. That is why the central question is this: will Europe wake up and start defending its own interests, or will it continue sacrificing them for Washington? And to make sure you don't miss new details of this unfolding crisis, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.